But welcome everyone to the fourth day of EAAMO'. We're really excited to welcome Dr. Sylvia Ortega Salazar to join us today. Dr. Ortega is a sociologist and an educator, and she served as the Vice Minister for Upper High School and VET of Mexico. She has held a variety of leadership positions in the education policy space. She has been rector of the Metropolitan Autonomous University Azcapotzalco, and she has been the first woman rector of a public university. She has been a rector of the National Pedagogical University. She has received numerous recognitions for academic achievement, for public service, and contributions to international education. And her lines of work include educational policy design and practice, teacher training and professional development, theories of educational change, as well as dual models of education and employability. As of January 2021, she was elected president of the National Advisory Council in Education. I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Ortega today to talk about new approaches to public policy design in education.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, colleagues. I'm very pleased, really, to be in this audience that I'm really in this type of Congress that it's really not my turf. I usually speak to teachers, to other policymakers, and now I need to address a very select and much younger set of people who are engaged in highly sophisticated intellectual endeavors in the area of computer science, of economics, and the likes. So let's see how it goes. As I was discussing with one of my colleagues in the panel while preparing for this occasion, he said, I'm not at all familiar with reality, but I know a lot about algorithms. And on my side, I said, I have a very, very tenuous idea of how algorithms work, but I'm very familiar with reality. I'm very familiar with failure, even with failure in policy and in policy design, and mainly in implementation. But I am also very hopeful that the human connections and the cooperative endeavors that we may identify are the avenue towards finding a more humane, a more satisfying world and satisfying life for everybody. So with that said, let me introduce the topic. In this very same week, the Ministry of Public Education is celebrating its first 100 years of existence. In October 1921, and after a very long civil war, very courageous, very, very bloody, well over 1 million people were killed. The main challenge was to integrate the nation. A very rural and dispersed, ethnically diverse population needed to be integrated with a national identity and needed to be educated. More than 2/3 of adults, of young adults, were illiterate. And the target was to get about 1/3 of children into schools. It was a very modest target, and yet there were no schools. So in a way, and in its adequate context, it was a very ambitious venture that the post-revolutionary state was engaging in. As the central strategy, they decided to launch what they called the cultural missions. Everybody, men and women who knew how to read and write, had to go out there to the country, to the small towns, and attract people to knowledge, read books to them, and forge a national identity. So that's what they did, and they did so quite successfully. But by the 90s, it was clear that accelerated expansion of school attendance, of teachers, of the system was not enough. Coverage as a priority had lacked in quality and had lacked, therefore, in opportunity. By the 90s, worldwide, we were engaged in economic modernization, in the ambition of participating in the world global economy in those days. And to that effect, quality of education and in all levels, science, technology, and evaluation were the central processes to enhance learning and competitivity and secure system-wide better results. Now, a cycle of 30 years of reforms ensued, and there were positive outcomes, like changes in a very formal curriculum that became a bit more worldly and more connected. Something that was a critical piece was the training of teachers and their professional development, as they were acknowledged as the main component of quality, not only teaching and learning, but also conditions that essentially a good teacher explained in the models the success of an individual and of a school. Of course, increased taxes and higher completion rates of a 15-year cycle. On the deficit side, no continuity of policies was pursued. The reforms were all top-down, very little consultation. There was enormous teacher resistance to evaluation, with consequences in their salaries. They saw that as an offense, and it probably was, and they saw it as unfair because of the diversity of not only teaching conditions, but populations served. And to sum it all up, the widening learning gaps between the haves and the have-nots continued to increase, thus accentuating inequity and exclusion. So by the 21st century, clearly, the system could not continue like that. Limited coverage, exclusion at a very early age, high dropout rates, unsatisfactory learning results for the majority, increased learning gaps by socioeconomic, ethnic, and residence factors, and more importantly, very difficult, almost impossible transitions to employment by the first decade of the 21st century. That had to do with highly segmented labor markets, with limited formal employments, with the very low wages, especially for people who were starting in the first employment after middle high school or after college, and limited access to higher education, very limited, only about 20% of the graduates of middle high school were able to continue into college. That is still more or less the case. However, the illiteracy rate is only 3.5%. I say only, but it represents actually a couple of million people. 93.9% of virtually all children 5 to 14 are in school, yet coverage of the 15 to 18 year cohort is only 80%, a little bit over 80% go to schools. Now, this is the way that the system looks. As you see, it is totally disarticulated. It is enormous. It's 36 million children and 2 million teachers that are dispersed in this type of arrangement, of institutional arrangement, and the governance is quite something. However, more I want to stress the dispersion, not of the population now, but of the services that this enormous system provides to the population. More emphatically, still, as in the revolutionary years, the poorest services are destined to rural, marginal, the poorest among the poor, the Indian and the disabled populations. As one eminent scholar put it, the poorest education goes to the poorest segments of the population. Now, it's not surprising that the learning results are very low, that the gaps between those who learn and those who basically go to school without much learning have been widening, and what I think is the representation of profound failure, intergenerational poverty cycles are reproduced at this point. Now let's look at who is out of school. Well, 5.3 million children and adolescents, and after the pandemic, probably up to 6 million children out of 22 million that are in this age group will be out of school. In this set, there will be an overrepresentation, there already is, of disabled children. And something that I also want to acknowledge is that after 12 years of age, school attendance decreases. So out of school children are concentrated in the 15 to 17-year-old group. This is how it looks by family income. The red line represents the lowest income group, while the blue one represents the richer group. And what you see is the gap, the increased gap of school attendance. Rural areas, the lack of school attendance is 17.1%. In urban zones is high, it's 13%, but the differential is significant. Almost 2.5 million children in poverty are out of school, and about half of them are Indian, and 208,000 are disabled. The gap increases by age and school level. So what do you want a system that does that? Now, in terms of results, here are a depiction of graphics from the performance of Mexican children in the OCDE PISA exam that's applied to all 15-year-olds. Two things: the determinants of performance are socioeconomic. And the differential between those more affluent and their poorest peers is 81 points in the score, which means about 2 years of, no, more than 2 years of school. But more importantly, it's like nothing has happened from the year 2000 to the year 2018, almost 20 years, and the scores have not substantially changed in reading, maths, and science. They remain stagnant. Now, after the sanitary emergency, well, what do you have? We still don't understand what the reclusion has done to children and adolescents. They are to be fully understood, but so far we know that they have been devastating, especially for the poorest. We know that it will have a pervasive effect in the social emotional abilities and school attachment, children are resisting going back to school. Older children, more especially than their younger counterparts. We know that there will be loss in learning. Some estimates are starting to see about 2 or even more than that, 2 years of school learning loss. And we expect very high dropout rates. They were already very high, especially in the 15 to 17 year age group, but it will be, we are expecting a more pronounced dropout of school. Is this attributable to school? Partly, but it's especially attributable to the development model in Latin American countries. The pandemic has only shown the dramatic inequality and exclusion in our societies. And we know that we will not recover employment in several years. There will be a persistence of informality that already engages well over 2/3 of the total economically active population. And there is already an increased number of poor and extremely poor people. The impact on girls and young women will be greater, or is already being measured as greater than in their male counterparts. That has to do with violence, with sexual harassment, with gender-specific problems that became more acute during the reclusion. CEPAL has estimated that a decade that we will lose a decade in the advancement in gender equality. Now, deepening of structural limitations of the economy will have an impact on the educational system that is also geared in that direction. And we have very little chances of really pushing forward this idea of changing the educational system slowly towards the support of a national project centered in justice, better wealth distribution, inclusion, and environmental sustainability. Now, we do have an opportunity. Technologically advanced sectors of business and the economy are growing and will do so faster. At least the estimates suggest that. Now, but do we have to see this terrible scenario just pass us by? Certainly not. As Jorge Luis Borges would put it, the future is not what will happen, but what we will do. Now, where do we start? Nothing seems to be working that it should. So where do we start? Well, we start reforming. It will not be enough to reform one more time. It will not be enough to wait for gradual changes, little changes to effect a transformation. We redesign, we reinvent. Towards what? Contextualized and diverse learning. We need to finish up our idea that all are well served with the same policies and programs and activities. We need to leave that to schools and the educational communities that need a lot more autonomy, a lot less bureaucracy and control and support. Now, we need to base policy, as we did in the past, on recent research, but especially in how we learn and how we develop as humans. What kind of skills and abilities are important to the economies, but more importantly, to social cohesion. We need to prioritize inclusion above all other considerations and really push for children to conceive ambitious trajectories for their life projects. Now, some student voices, just to illustrate you. It is crucial that we understand what children are prepared to accept, to acknowledge, and to do. Just two examples. In the left graphic, the bar graphic, what you see is a statement of well over 2/3 of recent high school graduates that affirm that they are prepared to go out and conquer the world. Maybe not, but they feel prepared. Now, on the right side, what you see is that almost half of them will postpone their plans to go to universities. So good news, but all in all, against adversity, we do have the optimism, the resilience, and the will of the young. What would we need to prioritize upon, now we are returning after 200 days of school closure. Difficult return. But what do we need to do? The first thing is to close that digital divide, to have internet for everybody, as the efforts at distance education only included about 70% of the children who had some kind of access. So we need internet, we need access to devices, and we need learning resources. We need to invent them. They are out there, but they need to be cured, they need to be classified, and above all, they need to be utilized by teachers. So that is where I see collaborative designs and public-private alliances. We need to acknowledge, to become familiar and empathic with student needs and dreams. Public school conditions are unacceptable. We don't have much in the line of personalized learning that is now so indispensable to serve every children according to their inclinations and aspirations. We need flexible routes to graduation, especially in face of the enormous dropout rates in this age. We need social-emotional development, and we don't know much about it. We need to see best practices, and we need to build the human connection with tutoring and mentoring as opportunities to rescue these young lives and young life projects. We need to build creative, stimulating school environments. We need reconciliation, we need peace building, sustainability, caring, and cohesion. Community building that will be so essential to the recovery of schools and school communities and the population at large. Yes, digital literacy for all the community through schools, certification of competencies, women in business, restoring the environment and preserving natural resources. That's community building, and that is in the center of community participation in schools and in guaranteeing successful trajectories for their children. Of course, nothing is possible without the continuous professional development of teachers and principals, with support, with recognition, with revaluing teaching and learning, and without leaving teachers to as responsible actors in leading change. What does this do? Well, it produces, and that has been demonstrated by the literature, individuals with critical thinking, digital abilities, socio-emotional skills, and that are prone to collaborative learning and teamwork. Those are the competencies. There are numerous lists, but this is a synthesis of the competencies needed in the 21st century. To end this participation, let me just affirm that we need to use knowledge, your knowledge and our knowledge, this intersection between powerful technologies and algorithms to understand processes and the realities of policy making, policy operating, consensus building, and community participations. If they converge, they will be successful. But we need to ask pertinent questions. Now, as the Futures of Education of UNESCO project says, knowledge and learning are the most important renewable sources that we have to respond to challenges and invent alternatives. Education does more than produce answers to a changing world. Education changes the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ortega. That was really inspiring to hear, especially on your notes on this being a collaborative process and everyone working together on all these different fronts, from like the emotional support, the empathetic response that we need to really build education together. I'd like to open for a short Q&A. We have a few minutes for that. There is already one question in the Q&A that I will read out loud. It's from Diego Macal. In rural areas of much of Latin America, kids usually help their parents with their subsistence farming activities. Has Mexico tried programs of offering school utensils, uniforms, and meals, breakfast and lunch to students? Would this entice rural parents to send their kids to school? Mexico is big and diverse, but on average, what would be the typical distance that kids need to walk to school in rural areas? Finally, could the internet help with that?
Yeah. Certainly, the internet is the only viable answer for this highly dispersed small populations of basically Indian peoples in all over the country, especially the north and the southeast. But Mexico developed a rural school model in the 30s that was incredibly successful in terms of providing rural poor children with, let's say, a total experience. Not only did they cultivate their parents' lands and the parents participated, and school provided for breakfasts and lunches, and sometimes they were interns, they resided in the schools. But they also were prepared to continue their education in the cities. Having said that, there is a vast experience in community of alternative education, but it has lacked in consistency and quality and coverage. In the 21st century, rural children are out of school because they migrate with their parents seasonally to work in the large and modern agribusiness units towards the north. There is an internal migration cycle that impedes children to go to school. So those who stay back end up walking up to 2 hours back and forth. So indeed, there are some experiments with internet, especially in Chihuahua with the Tarahumara that are so far away from each other and from the cities. But the limitation is with the speed of the internet and the accessibility. Now the government is working on a plan for rural provision of internet to everybody without cost or at minimal cost. So yeah, indeed, we do need to go back to what we know that works in rural schools, but with internet. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible to close the gap in quality. And even if the education is inspiring, it still needs to be competitive.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Ortega. If there are any other questions or thoughts, please add them into the Q&A. In the meantime, I'll ask a question of my own. You mentioned this obstacle, of course, that for everyone with COVID-19. What are some of the biggest obstacles that you saw with the pandemic? Was it like the internet access that was not facilitated well, given the nature of having to do a lot of online learning? Were there other obstacles that you think were very important that were difficult to overcome during the pandemic itself? And do you see any, what are some like good policies that you think would be important to overcome that, given that we're still during a pandemic and it might still take a while until everything is back to normal?
Well, I may start with the last part, Anna. I don't think going back to normal is a good idea, because normal was totally undesirable, as we saw with the, hints that I gave you in terms of information. Now, the pandemic was a surprise for everybody, especially the government. We were all disconcerted, and it took a long time before some reaction was visible, some initiatives were available. Basically, the first, we closed the schools in March 1920. And the government thought and communicated that it was to be a short period, based maybe a month or two. So over a month or two, there was basically nothing until, teachers were concerned about their students, and individual responses were there, very exemplary and very good practices, but isolated, not at all organized by the government or the educational authorities. By the 6th month, it was clear that the period would be prolonged, so the ministry put out 3 initiatives. One, the television. TV programs were produced with material that was not pertinent, not very high quality, but it was an alternative. Now, not everybody participated in the TV learning, and it's doubtful whether it made a difference. Second initiative, more robust, was using platforms for distance learning, teaching and learning. However, only 70% of all children had access to the internet and devices. Most of the teaching was done not through the platforms, but through messages. WhatsApp in particular became extremely popular. And the third initiative was to let communities organize activities with the parents and other community members in the gardens and open spaces sporadically. It was not until much later, really, end of 2020, when the governmental provision of alternatives was clearer and more substantive, but not in all states. So I am confirming here that there was very little coordination in such a large system to provide children with the right to be educated somehow, even in the closure of schools. Now, on the good side, I would say that the government was very careful with health, security, and measures that are, to this point, implemented in schools that have reopened, which is about half of them.
Great, thank you for that answer. We have one last question, which is coming from one of our in-person watch parties. The question is the following. Given the constraints in teaching from the pandemic, I'm curious what novel aspects of teaching work best? And what do you think might be good to persist? For example, you mentioned WhatsApp messages as a form of pedagogy. What aspects of this work well in the context of those who have the most to lose from in-person teaching? Sorry, this question is from Francisca.
Right. Well, that is in my perception, the best part of the pandemic, the teachers. I mean, of the teaching in the pandemic experience, the teachers. Teachers were extremely creative. They prepared to teach and use platforms from Teams to Zoom to everything available. They took crash courses, they shared practice, they built networks, but above all, they adapted to their children. It was spectacular in preschool, where they shared the experience with mothers and fathers that became involved in their children's education, not everywhere, not at large, but the best practices are there. And in the 15 to 17-year-old age group, the communities, the municipalities in some parts of the country fostered this children's participation in prevention, in vaccination, in caring for the older populations, thus affording a very moving experience for these children and a very relevant knowledge that was not school related, but it's there, it's knowledge, it's profound learning, is significant. So teachers were the best. Now the challenge is to keep them inspired, prepared, and to respect what they did. Cease sending them instructions and acknowledge that they are the professionals and they know what to do with each child in each classroom in school. That's what we need to change, and that is a very profound change for a system that is top-down, that is vertical, and that is extremely bureaucratic.
Thank you, that was very insightful. One last question in the Q&A, and then we'll head to the poster session in just a couple of minutes. The question is from Paula Rodriguez. Do you see a way that schools with higher resources and quality could collaborate with low income or quality to reduce the learning gaps? What would be the most effective way of doing it? There are a couple of private schools doing this in Colombia with other public schools, but it's not a national level thing there. Would this type of collaborations work as a national program, or should it be driven by schools themselves?
I think that all initiatives should be led by schools. And it's school communities that should determine what kind of alliance they want to build. I am a big believer in alliances and networks. I don't see any other way out in the next few years for investing in education and resources and in other, not only in resources, but in conditions, school conditions in all of Latin America, probably with a few exceptions like Chile, certain parts of Colombia, and certain parts in Mexico. But in general, school conditions are deplorable. They're unacceptable. And that is not going to be remedied with public funds. There will need to be alliances, not only for building and getting water supplies and bathrooms, but also to develop new pedagogies, new alternatives in educational technology. And that should be determined by the school in collaboration with public and private agents. And it should be, in my mind, concentrated in public schools. There are very inspiring examples in private schools that serve poor children. That's true. Very powerful models. But the thing is that public schools in our countries serve 87% of basic education children. So that's where the problem is, and that is where it should be. It should be policies and programs should be designed to affect that change. Let the school communities decide.
Great, thank you so much. That was very, very insightful, and definitely agree with this idea on the alliances. The last comment from Francisco: if there's like any systemic way of keeping track of best novel practices and rewarding their efforts accordingly, because we can learn a lot from their creative adaptations that the teachers had. So with that in mind, I think we can end the Q&A here, if that's all right with you. It was very inspiring, and we'll transition into the poster session. Thank you so much, Dr. Ortega,